Have you ever stopped to wonder how close you've been to danger without realizing it? At the Shivering Vault, we take you there one chilling story at a time. Before we dive into today's tale, be sure to like, subscribe, and tell us where you're tuning in from. Now, let's unlock another unsettling account. I don't usually take road trips, but this time I didn't have a choice. My cousin was tying the knot in San Antonio, and flights from Phoenix were way out of my budget. So, I decided to drive. It seemed straightforward, just me, the open road, and a playlist to keep me awake. I planned to leave early enough to cover most of the drive before dark, but things didn't go as planned. Work ran late, and by the time I got on the highway, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. As midnight approached, the long stretch of highway became a dark, empty ribbon. With barely a car in sight, my headlights were the only thing cutting through the void, broken occasionally by signs for gas stations or motels. At first, I enjoyed the stillness. It was oddly peaceful. But then, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror, a car trailing me. It wasn't unusual, of course, but something about the way they lingered struck me as strange. It was a black sedan, and instead of passing, it stayed too close, its headlights fixed on me like they were locked in place. I thought maybe they were just being cautious in the dark or didn't want to risk speeding. Trying not to overthink, I slowed down slightly, hoping they'd pass. They didn't. They matched my speed. My grip on the wheel tightened, unease spreading through me like a slow burn. Brushing it off as paranoia, I decided to take an exit, figuring they'd stay on the highway. But as I turned off, the sedan followed. My pulse quickened. Telling myself it was just a coincidence, I turned onto a smaller, less trafficked road. The car mirrored every move I made, the headlights bright and unwavering in the rearview. Each twist and turn only deepened my growing dread. By the time I pulled into a dimly lit gas station, my hands were shaking. I parked and watched. Maybe this would be the moment they'd keep driving and prove me wrong. Instead, they parked too, a few spaces away. The silhouette of someone sitting in the driver's seat was unmistakable. Pretending to check my phone, I stole quick glances at the car. Minutes ticked by, feeling like hours. Then, without warning, they backed out and drove off. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. My instincts urged me to wait a little longer, so I lingered another 10 minutes before cautiously pulling back onto the highway. For a few miles, the road was empty again, and my nerves started to settle. But just when I thought it was over, I spotted those same headlights in my mirror. My heart sank. They were back. This time, their presence felt deliberate. My stomach twisted as I realized this was no coincidence. I debated calling the police but hesitated. What could I say? They hadn't done anything illegal yet. Swallowing my fear, I tried to focus on driving, keeping my speed steady and my hands firmly on the wheel. But no matter what I did, the weight of their presence pressed down on me like a physical force. Every moment behind the wheel stretched endlessly, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. As I scanned for options, I spotted a rest stop sign up ahead and made a split-second decision to pull in. My plan was to park near other cars or, if possible, go inside if it felt safe. But as I rolled into the lot, dread crept back in. The rest stop was completely deserted, no cars, no people, just an eerie silence under flickering yellow lights. I hesitated, wondering if stopping had been a mistake. The sedan slowed but didn't follow me in. Instead, it rolled past the entrance and disappeared down the highway. I sat in the car, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe I had been overthinking everything. Maybe they were just heading the same way after all. Telling myself I was imagining things, I waited a few minutes before pulling out of the lot and merging back onto the highway. But any relief I felt was short-lived. Within minutes, those familiar headlights were back, and this time, they weren't subtle. The sedan closed the gap between us quickly, its headlights practically glued to my rearview mirror. My hands felt clammy, and my throat tightened as panic bubbled to the surface. I sped up, hoping to put some distance between us, but they matched my every move, their headlights glaring like an unspoken threat. The emptiness of the road amplified my fear. With no witnesses and nowhere to hide, the isolation felt suffocating. Desperate to shake them, I abruptly switched lanes, but they mirrored me again. I took another random exit, my heart pounding with each turn, but they followed every move. It was clear now, this wasn't coincidence. I needed to get away. Veering onto a winding back road, I prayed the tight curves might help me lose them, but they only grew bolder. Their headlights filled my mirrors, blinding me, and their engine roared louder as they drew closer. The sense of isolation deepened, the night swallowing any hope of finding help nearby. Then, out of nowhere, they rammed the back of my car. The first collision sent a shockwave through me as the sedan slammed into the rear of my car, jolting me forward. My grip tightened on the wheel as I fought to maintain control, my pulse racing with the horrifying realization they weren't just following me. They were trying to force me off the road. Panic surged as I pressed the gas pedal to the floor, but the uneven terrain made it difficult to gain speed. My car swerved violently with each strike, the second hit even harder than the first, sending my back tires fishtailing on the loose gravel. My knuckles were white against the wheel as I spotted a sharp turn ahead and veered toward it, hoping to lose them in the twists of the back road. But they were relentless, their headlights piercing through my mirrors, glaring like twin beacons of menace. Suddenly, they rammed me again, this time with enough force to send my car skidding off the road and into a shallow ditch. The impact left me stunned, my breath knocked from my lungs, my ears ringing. As I fumbled with the seatbelt, trying to reorient myself, I heard the crunch of gravel behind me. Through the haze of adrenaline, I saw the driver's door of the sedan swing open. A man stepped out, silhouetted against the glow of his headlights, a crowbar glinting in his hand. My entire body froze in terror as he began walking toward me, his movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring every second. The weight of fear pressed down on me, making my limbs feel like lead. My brain screamed at me to move, to act, but I was paralyzed, unable to do anything but watch as he drew closer. By the time I finally managed to unbuckle my seatbelt, he was only a few feet away. I scrambled to grab my phone, but it had flown off the seat during the crash. My hands frantically searched the darkened floor until they landed on something cold and metallic, my car keys. I clenched them tightly, realizing they might be my only defense. The man reached the driver's side window and raised the crowbar, bringing it down with brutal force. The glass shattered, shards scattering across me as I ducked just in time to avoid the blow. He didn't hesitate, reaching through the broken window to unlock the door. I kicked at his arm, but his grip was unyielding, his strength terrifying, as if fueled by pure adrenaline. The door yanked open, and I threw the keys at his face in a desperate attempt to slow him down. It wasn't much, but it was enough to create a fleeting moment of distraction. Summoning every ounce of strength, I shoved the door with all my weight, slamming it into him and bolting out the passenger side. The uneven ground caught my feet as I ran, adrenaline pumping through my veins. Behind me, I could hear his heavy footsteps and the crunch of gravel as he pursued me, his curses cutting through the night air. My lungs burned, my legs screamed for relief, but I couldn't stop, not with him so close. The open road was too far away, and the surrounding darkness offered no sanctuary. Then, through the gloom, I spotted a cluster of trees up ahead and veered toward them, hoping they might provide cover. I ducked behind the thickest tree trunk I could find, pressing my back against the rough bark, struggling to quiet my ragged breaths. My heart pounded so violently I was sure he could hear it. For a moment, everything was still. I strained my ears, desperate to catch any sound of his movement. Then, cutting through the silence, his voice came, low and calm, far too close for comfort. "You can't hide forever." A shiver ran down my spine as I clamped a hand over my mouth, tears streaming down my face. His footsteps grew louder, circling the trees as though he were toying with me, dragging out the moment like it was some twisted game. I scanned the ground desperately, searching for anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes landed on a jagged branch lying just a few feet away. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. As his footsteps momentarily faded, I made my move. Grabbing the branch, I broke into a sprint, aiming for the faint glow of headlights in the distance, another car, my only chance at escape. My legs felt like they were on fire, but the thought of him catching me kept me moving. I waved my arms frantically, screaming at the top of my lungs as the vehicle approached. Relief surged through me as it slowed down, but my relief was short-lived. The man was right behind me. I turned just in time to see him lunging toward me, the crowbar raised high. Without thinking, I swung the branch as hard as I could. The jagged wood connected with his shoulder, and he stumbled back, grunting in pain. The driver of the stopped car, a middle-aged man wielding a baseball bat, jumped out, yelling something I couldn't make out over the blood pounding in my ears. The man with the crowbar hesitated, his eyes darting between me and the newcomer. For a brief moment, it felt like time stood still. Then, without a word, he turned and bolted back toward his sedan, disappearing into the night. I collapsed onto the ground, trembling uncontrollably as the other driver called the police. When the officers arrived, the man was long gone, his car vanishing into the darkness like a specter. The police assured me they'd patrol the area, but the thought of him still out there left me shaken. That night, I learned just how fragile safety can be, how quickly the ordinary can spiral into a nightmare. Even now, I can't drive alone at night without feeling the weight of his shadow, the memory of his crowbar gleaming in the moonlight, a constant reminder of how close I came to losing everything. The man lingered near my car, his demeanor shifting subtly as I reached for the water bottle. I could feel his eyes scanning the interior, his movements just a bit too deliberate to be casual. My gut churned with unease, but I forced myself to stay calm. As I handed him the bottle through the cracked window, I noticed he had stepped closer, too close. The air seemed to thicken as my instincts screamed that something wasn't right. He unscrewed the cap and took a long drink, his eyes never leaving mine. "You sure you can't give me a ride?" he asked again, his tone a touch more insistent than before. My chest tightened, but I managed to keep my voice steady as I repeated, "Sorry, I can't." For a moment, he didn't respond. He just stared at me, the edges of his mouth curling into what might have been a smile, though it felt more like a warning. "All right, man," he said finally, stepping back, his body language stiff with what I could only describe as suppressed frustration. I nodded, relieved to see him retreating slightly, but my relief was short-lived. As I started to roll up the window, his hand shot out, gripping the edge of the door with startling speed. My heart leapt into my throat as he leaned closer, his voice dropping into a menacing whisper. I wasn't asking. Time seemed to freeze as the gravity of the situation hit me. I tried to lock the doors, but he was already yanking the handle. The door flew open, and before I could react, he reached inside, brandishing a knife. It wasn't large, but the sight of the blade gleaming in the afternoon light sent a jolt of terror through me. "Wallet and keys," he demanded, his voice low and cold. My hands shook as I fumbled to comply, tossing my wallet onto the passenger seat and reaching for the ignition. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but his presence loomed too close. He gestured with the knife, signaling for me to step out. My legs felt like lead as I slid out of the car, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Just walk," he muttered, motioning toward the side of the road. I obeyed, taking slow, deliberate steps away from the vehicle. My mind raced, searching for a way out. Then, as he turned briefly to grab my wallet, I saw my chance. Without thinking, I bolted, my feet pounding against the gravel as I sprinted toward the scrubby bushes lining the highway. Behind me, I heard him shout, followed by the sound of his heavy boots crunching the ground. The knife flashed in my mind, pushing me to run faster, the adrenaline drowning out the burning in my lungs. I dove into the bushes, crouching low and pressing my body against the dry, brittle branches. The faint rustle of leaves as he searched for me sent shivers down my spine. "You can't hide forever," his voice called out, calm but filled with venom. I clamped a hand over my mouth, stifling my shaky breaths. My heart felt like it would give me away, pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Peering through the foliage, I spotted a jagged rock nearby. Desperation overtook fear as I reached for it, gripping the rough surface tightly. When his footsteps grew louder, I knew he was closing in. My muscles coiled as I waited for the right moment. Just as his shadow passed by, I sprang out, swinging the rock with all my strength. The impact caught him off guard, landing against his shoulder. He stumbled back with a growl, clutching his arm. I didn't wait to see his next move. I ran, my legs trembling with exhaustion but fueled by sheer survival instinct. In the distance, the faint outline of a truck appeared on the horizon, its headlights cutting through the haze of fear clouding my vision. I waved my arms frantically, screaming for help. The truck slowed as I collapsed onto the road, gasping for air. A burly man stepped out, his face etched with concern as he sized up the situation. Behind me, the attacker lingered, his expression shifting between anger and calculation. The man from the truck didn't hesitate. He grabbed a crowbar from the bed of his vehicle and yelled, "Get back!" His voice boomed with authority, sending the attacker into retreat. The knife-wielding man backed away, his gaze darting between us before he finally turned and fled toward the car he had abandoned on the roadside. The roar of his engine echoed as he sped off, disappearing into the distance. I collapsed onto the gravel, my body trembling uncontrollably as the truck driver helped me to my feet. He stayed with me until the police arrived, their flashing lights bathing the desolate highway in blue and red. The officers combed the area but found little evidence beyond the tire tracks and my scattered belongings. They assured me they'd patrol the area, but I knew the man was long gone. To this day, I can't drive alone on empty highways without the creeping fear of being followed. Every car feels like a threat, every pause like a trap waiting to spring. That encounter left me shaken to my core, a grim reminder of how quickly a seemingly ordinary moment can spiral into something dangerous. Trusting my instincts might have saved my life, but the memory of that knife, the weight of his gaze, and the sound of his footsteps in the dark still haunt me. As I handed the man the bottle through the barely open window, he took a long, deliberate drink, his eyes never leaving me. With an exaggerated wipe of his mouth using the back of his hand, he leaned closer to the car, invading the small barrier of safety I thought I had. "You're really not going to give me a ride?" "It'd really help me out," he said again, his voice tinged with a subtle pressure that hadn't been there before. A cold sense of unease crept over me, and I shook my head firmly. "Sorry, I can't," I replied, my voice carrying the edge of finality. For a brief moment, he just stood there, his expression unreadable. But then, something shifted. His frustration morphed into something darker, something that sent a chill racing down my spine. "All right," he muttered finally, stepping back with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Thanks for the water." Relief washed over me as I nodded, my hand already moving toward the window controls. But before I could close it, he lunged forward, gripping the door handle with startling speed and force. "What the hell?" I shouted, fumbling to lock the doors, but it was too late. The door wrenched open, and in a flash, a knife appeared in his hand. The blade glinted menacingly in the fading daylight, its presence freezing me in place. "Keys and wallet." "Now," he demanded, his voice low, calm, and terrifyingly steady. My hands trembled as I tried to process the situation. Every instinct screamed at me to fight back, but the cold, unwavering steel of the knife kept me rooted to the seat. Slowly, I reached for my wallet, my fingers struggling to work through the haze of fear clouding my thoughts. I tossed it onto the passenger seat, my breath coming in shallow gasps, and then shakily handed over my keys. "Get out," he commanded, motioning with the knife toward the road. His tone left no room for argument. My legs felt like lead as I climbed out of the car, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. The man stood there for a moment, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I thought he would get in the car and drive off, but instead, he just stared, as though deciding what to do next. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said suddenly, though the knife in his hand made it impossible to believe. "Just walk. Don't look back." I didn't need any more encouragement. I turned and began walking down the empty road, my legs trembling with every step. The sound of the car door slamming shut and the engine roaring to life sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I expected him to drive away, but he didn't. Instead, he sat there, idling, the engine rumbling like a predator biding its time. I kept walking, forcing myself to focus on the rhythm of my steps, but the weight of his gaze burned into my back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the car's tires crunched against the gravel as he pulled away. Even then, I didn't stop. I kept walking, my pulse still racing, my ears straining for any sign that he might return. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, the isolation amplifying my fear. It wasn't until I spotted the faint outline of headlights in the distance that I dared to slow down. Waving my arms frantically, I flagged down the approaching car, my voice hoarse as I pleaded for help. The driver, a kind older man, pulled over immediately. He took one look at my disheveled state and ushered me into his vehicle, locking the doors before calling the police. By the time the officers arrived, the man in my car were long gone. They assured me they'd search the area, but I knew he had vanished into the night, taking my belongings and a piece of my peace of mind with him. To this day, I can't shake the memory of his expression, the way his face shifted from frustration to something far more sinister in the blink of an eye. Every time I see someone stranded on the side of the road, a knot forms in my stomach, and I drive past, haunted by the knowledge that my instincts saved my life that day. It's a cruel reality, but one I'll never forget. Not everyone who asks for help has good intentions. The faint crunch of gravel just a few feet from my car made my heart lurch. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the otherwise eerie silence. I froze, every muscle tense, my breath shallow as I strained to listen for any sound, any movement. The night air felt suffocating, and my mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? A trick of the wind? Or something far more sinister? I didn't dare turn the car on. It felt like that single action would paint a target on my back, alerting whoever or whatever might be out there. At the same time, staying still felt equally dangerous, like waiting for something unseen to close the gap. My hand instinctively reached for my phone, but the screen mocked me with the dreaded no signal. Great. Just perfect. I bit my lip, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than a deer or a raccoon. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, unease crept through me like a cold fog. Minutes dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. Every few moments, I would hear it again, gravel shifting, a soft rustling of leaves, or the faintest scrape of something brushing against the car's exterior. The sounds were too deliberate, too calculated, to be random. My chest tightened as I debated my options, paralyzed by indecision. And then, the worst happened. The car rocked slightly, not enough to seem aggressive, but enough to confirm that something, or someone, was there. My breath hitched, and my eyes darted to the windows, but the darkness outside was impenetrable. Even the faint outline of bushes and trees had dissolved into shadows. I felt like a prisoner in a cage, trapped in the safety of my vehicle yet vulnerable to whatever was just outside. And then I heard it. The unmistakable, chilling sound of metal scraping against metal. My heart leaped into my throat. It started faintly, almost hesitant, but grew louder and more deliberate with each second. My blood ran cold as the reality set in. Someone was trying to get into the car. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the keys, silently praying I could start the car before they succeeded. The sound continued, now accompanied by a slight prying noise near the driver's side door. Panic surged through me, and my fingers slipped on the ignition as I tried to turn the key. Finally, the engine roared to life, and the headlights cut through the oppressive darkness like a lifeline. What I saw froze me in place. A man crouched near my door, a crowbar clutched tightly in his hand. His face was pale and smudged with dirt, and his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach churn. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, instinct kicked in. Without thinking, I threw the car into reverse and slammed my foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the gravel, spraying it in every direction as the car jolted backward. The man stumbled, caught off guard, but he didn't fall. Instead, he stood his ground, watching me with an eerie calm as I sped away. The crowbar hung limply from his hand, catching the light as he turned to face my retreating vehicle. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. The brightly lit gas station felt like a sanctuary, and I parked under one of the buzzing fluorescent lights, my heart still racing. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, unable to steady my breathing or calm the storm of thoughts in my head. What if I hadn't woken up? What if I hadn't started the car in time? The what-ifs circled relentlessly, each one more terrifying than the last. Even now, I can't pass one of those roadside pull-offs without a knot forming in my stomach. The thought of sleeping in my car again feels impossible. That night changed something in me, a fundamental shift in how I view the world. I've heard people call it paranoia, but to me, it feels like survival, a hard-learned lesson that not all danger comes with warning signs, and sometimes the quietest moments hide the loudest threats. I muttered under my breath, trying to calm my nerves as I reached into the glove compartment for my flashlight. The heavy air outside felt suffocating, pressing down on me as I stepped out of the car. Even the usual sounds of the night, chirping crickets or rustling leaves, were strangely absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that made every step I took toward the man feel louder than it should. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating his motionless form sprawled by the roadside. Something about the scene didn't sit right with me. His posture seemed unnatural, his limbs awkwardly splayed like a puppet dropped mid-performance. "Hey, are you okay? Can you hear me?" I called out, my voice trembling as I cautiously approached. The lack of response only heightened my unease. I stopped a few feet away, debating whether to get closer, when a sudden flicker of movement caught the edge of my vision. Not from the man on the ground, but from the shadows beyond the car. My breath hitched as a second figure emerged, stepping smoothly into the dim light. "Need some help, friend?" the newcomer asked, his voice low and measured, carrying a faint rasp. He was tall and broad-shouldered, a baseball cap pulled low enough to obscure his eyes. My heart began to race as I realized I hadn't even noticed him lurking there. "No, I'm good," I replied quickly, taking a cautious step backward, my flashlight trembling in my grip. He smirked, the faintest hint of amusement tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Doesn't look like it," he said, his tone laced with something I couldn't quite place. "You're real kind to stop like this." My instinct screamed at me to leave, but my legs felt leaden. I forced myself to keep moving backward, my focus darting between the man lying on the ground and the one now standing between me and my car. "I don't want any trouble," I stammered, my voice cracking. "I thought someone needed help, that's all." The man took a deliberate step closer, his presence radiating a quiet menace. "Oh, we do," he said, his voice soft but chilling. His hand moved behind his back, and my stomach dropped as I saw the unmistakable shape of a weapon, something metallic glinting faintly in the dim light. I didn't think. I just ran. My flashlight clattered to the ground as I bolted toward my car, my mind a blur of adrenaline and panic. Behind me, I heard the man shout something, his footsteps pounding against the pavement as he gave chase. My shaking hands fumbled for my keys as I reached the car, and I barely managed to slam the door shut and hit the lock button before he reached me. His face appeared inches from mine through the window, contorted in anger. "Get out," he roared, slamming his fist against the glass with enough force to make it tremble. I didn't waste a second. Throwing the car into reverse, I hit the gas, my tires screeching as they spun against the pavement. Gravel sprayed in every direction as I backed onto the highway. In my rearview mirror, I saw the other man, the one who had been lying on the ground, scrambling to his feet and sprinting toward me. I floored the accelerator, my heart pounding as their figures grew smaller in the mirror, but the image of their faces was burned into my mind. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, pulling into the safety of a brightly lit gas station. My hands were still trembling as I reached for my phone to call the police, recounting every detail in a voice shaky with fear. By the time the officers arrived at the scene, the men and their vehicle had disappeared. The officer I spoke to listened carefully but seemed unsurprised. "You're lucky," he told me bluntly. "This kind of thing happens more often than you'd think." Lucky didn't even begin to cover it. The memory of that night still haunts me. Now, every time I pass a car stranded by the roadside, I grip the wheel a little tighter and keep driving. I've learned the hard way that not every cry for help is what it seems, and sometimes, trusting your instincts is the only thing standing between you and danger. The gas station was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the rhythmic ticking of the gas pump. There was no sign of an attendant, no other cars pulling in, just me and the man standing there with his duffel bag. Against every warning I'd ever been told, I hesitated, then muttered, "All right, sure," trying to keep my unease hidden. His reaction wasn't what I expected. There was no relief or gratitude in his expression. Instead, he just nodded, slung the bag over his shoulder, and climbed into the passenger seat without a word. The moment he shut the door, the atmosphere shifted. The air inside the car seemed heavier, carrying the stale sense of sweat and smoke that clung to him. I forced myself to make small talk, hoping to diffuse my growing anxiety. "What's your name?" I asked, gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. "Joe," he replied curtly, barely glancing at me. Something about the way he said it didn't sit right, but I didn't press further. As we drove, the road stretched on, dark and unbroken, with nothing but the faint glow of my headlights cutting through the void. The silence between us was suffocating, broken only by the occasional shuffle of him shifting in his seat. His hands fidgeted in his lap, but I couldn't make out what he was doing. My pulse quickened as my unease grew. "So, what were you doing out there?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light, though my voice betrayed a slight tremor. "Just passing through," he replied without looking at me, his tone dismissive. I wanted to ask more, to figure out who this man really was, but the tension in the car was palpable, and I decided it was safer to stay quiet. Minutes passed, each one stretching unbearably long, until he finally broke the silence. "You can pull off up ahead," he said suddenly, pointing to the dark expanse of highway ahead. "There's a shortcut I know that'll get me where I need to go." My stomach nodded. I squinted at the road but saw no signs of a turn or a shortcut, just the endless stretch of empty highway. "I'd rather stay on the main road," I replied carefully, trying to keep my tone steady. That was when he turned to face me for the first time since getting in the car. His eyes were dark, his expression unreadable, but there was something in his gaze that made my skin crawl. I said, "Pull off up there," he repeated, his voice lower now, with a sharp edge that left no room for argument. Then I saw it, a flash of metal as he pulled a knife from inside his jacket, holding it low, just out of direct sight. He wasn't brandishing it wildly or making sudden movements, but the threat was clear. My heart thundered in my chest as I struggled to keep my grip on the wheel, my palms slick with sweat. "Take the next turn," he instructed calmly, his tone terrifyingly casual, as though this were just another everyday conversation. Panic coursed through me, but I forced myself to nod, feigning compliance as I slowed the car. My mind raced, searching desperately for a way out. I couldn't take that turn. I knew if I did, there was no coming back. My voice shook as I blurted out, "I need to pull over for a second. Been holding it for a while. Just need to take a quick leak." He stared at me for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Finally, he gave a slight nod. "Make it quick," he muttered, his grip on the knife still firm. I eased the car to the side of the road, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. My hand trembled as I reached for the keys, pocketing them along with my phone before stepping out of the car. The cool night air hit me like a slap, but I didn't let it slow me down. I moved toward the bushes, pretending to look for a spot, but as soon as I was out of his line of sight, I ran. My legs carried me into the darkness, each frantic step kicking up loose gravel and dirt. Behind me, I could hear him shouting, his voice growing angrier with every passing second. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I stumbled into a shallow ditch and crouched down, trying to catch my breath while dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The operator's voice was a distant lifeline, grounding me just enough to explain my location, or at least as close as I could estimate. My lungs burned, and my ears strained for any sound of him approaching, but the only thing I could hear was my own ragged breathing. It felt like an eternity before the flashing lights of a patrol car finally appeared in the distance. By the time the police arrived, both the man and my car were gone. Hours later, they found it abandoned in a field a few miles away. Inside the duffel bag, they discovered zip ties, duct tape, and a roll of plastic sheeting, tools that painted a chilling picture of what could have happened if I hadn't escaped. To this day, I don't know what his true intentions were, but I'm certain of one thing: running was the only reason I survived. The memory of his calm demeanor, the weight of that knife in his hand, and the suffocating dread I felt in those moments will never leave me. It's a cruel reminder of how quickly a simple act of kindness can turn into a fight for your life. I've learned my lesson. Sometimes, the safest thing you can do is to keep driving, no matter how much someone pleads for help.